Hey guys, welcome to part 11, where we are going to be discussing the modulation matrix inside of Serum. So as you can see on the screen right now, what you see right here, this is the mod matrix. And I have that growl sound pulled up that we were using in part 10. Okay, and we made all those connections, if you remember. We made a bunch of them, around 20 or 22, but we did it all with drag and drop. So you can see those connections are all still active, and that's why this sound has so many active modulation inputs and destinations, because that's what we did doing the drag and drop. So the first thing I want to touch on is anything you do drag and drop will show up in the mod matrix, and anything you do inside the mod matrix will show up on the actual synth itself. By that, I mean, let's look at envelope 1. It's not modulating anything, so I'm going to have it modulate the mix of my cutoff filter. I'm going to have it turn it down. So if we go to the mod matrix, that's now going to be added. See, envelope 1, filter mix. Now let's say, I actually made the sound kind of cool. Who knew? Let's say I want to change that to a different setting, and I'm on the mod matrix window. Well, I can go to change that to LFO, and now it's an LFO. And if I go back to the oscillator tab and I click on LFO1, well, now that connection that I just made in the mod matrix is actually visual, and you can see it on the actual oscillator itself. So these are very interconnected. Anything you do on one will be represented on the other. Now let's talk about why there are two different ways to modulate in Serum, because most synths, or most soft synths, historically only give us one option. Massive is all very visual drag and drop, and Silent, for instance, is mod matrix. Well, why does Serum have two? It has the two different methods for two reasons. The first is usability. Myself, I like to do the drag and drop a little bit more than the mod matrix. And there are going to be people who like to do the mod matrix more than the drag and drop. So you have both ways, whatever makes most sense to your brain, because the creator of Serum didn't want it to feel like a tedium to do modulation, wanted to keep it very musical. The best way to do that is to give people choices. The second reason is there are some things you can do in the mod matrix that you just cannot do in the drag and drop, make a connection on the oscillator tab. And we'll get into what those are a little bit later. But before we get into those, I need to discuss the layout of the actual modulation matrix, which we'll do now. So it is a grid in a table, and you get all these different sections. So the first section is your source tab. And when you click it, you will be looking at a drop-down menu. And now these are all the sources that you can use to modulate in Serum. Your sources have to ultimately go to a destination. If they don't go to a destination, they won't be doing anything. So that's like this idea of, I have these envelopes and these LFOs, they're just sitting there chilling. I have to make a connection. So once I make a connection to a point inside the synth, that is my destination. So we're going to remove the one I just added. So once you kind of get your mind wrapped around that idea that you need to have a source, pick your source, and that source has to go to a destination. Now this is maybe why I'm a very visual learner, which might be why I drift towards the drag and drop way, because you have to know your sources and your destinations in and out to do this very efficiently. So let's go talk about this curve. This curve is really cool. It's basically something that will scale the source and the destination. So when you have it grayed out, it means it's off. And if you want a more pronounced or quicker effect of what you're doing, you can turn it and make it look more like a square, or you can turn it down to have less of an effect. Now the reason this is here is, let's say you have an LFO, for instance, and it's modulating a bunch of parameters, kind of like our first LFO. It's modulating 11 different destinations. Well, let's say on one of those destinations, I didn't want it to happen at the speed of the LFO setting. Let's say I want it to happen a little bit later or sooner. I would then scale it with this curve here. Going over to the right, you'll see this amount slider. Now this amount slider is this a different representation of your modulation depth on your oscillator page. So let's look at the, let's go to envelope 2, and we're going to turn down bend plus on the A warp. It'll stand for A warp because we're on oscillator A and this is the warp knob. So I'm going to turn it down to 0. So if I go to my matrix now and I go to envelope 2, A warp, which is our first source and destination, it's at 0. Now I'm going to crank this all the way to the left, which is a negative value of 100. I can expect, before I go back to my oscillator tab, that the bend knob on my oscillator A is now going to be, the depth of the modulation is going to be all the way to the left. And it is. So that's kind of where you can control the depth of your modulation on the mod matrix. I'm going to jump over to this type real quick because this is directly tied to the slider here. This type is going to choose and determine whether the destination is a bidirectional modulation or a unidirectional modulation. And we touched on this actually in part 10. You can do this without going to the mod matrix, but if we take the bend plus example we just used, and I hold down Shift and Alt, this now goes to a bidirectional. It's going both ways. And if I unclick, it goes back to being unidirectional. Well, you can do that in the mod matrix as well with this type. When the arrow is just one arrow pointing to the right, it is a unidirectional. When you click, it's now bidirectional. See, it's now bidirectional on the synth itself. So that's what that type does. Now this destination box, kind of already touched on this. This is what your source modulator is going to be modulating. So if you want your LFO to modulate your filter cutoff, you're going to select a LFO, and then you're going to send it to your filter cutoff. Speaking of these destinations, this is where you can do some things that you can't do on the oscillator tab. And those are, you cannot modulate the master tune or the amp or the chaos 1 and 2 rate from this tab. So that's the second reason why this mod matrix exists. You can't do that on the drag and drop GUI. So let's say you wanted to do master tune for like a zap LFO or a laser or an FX. This is how you do it. Chaos 1 and 2 rate we have not talked about because that's sitting on the global tab, but we'll talk about those in the upcoming video. Okay, so now let's go on to the aux source, and to show you how this works, we're going to clear out of this growl bass. So goodbye, Mr. Growl Bass, and we're going to go to the initial preset. So let me find the LFO1 for my source. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to then assign that to the A course pitch, and I know I have to do the A course pitch because oscillator B is not active by default. So now I need to bump this up just a little bit. If we go back to our oscillator, it should look like, let me click on the LFO. It should look like this. And I'll make the depth just a little bit more. So now we have a really annoying LFO buzzy sound, but it'll work for this demonstration purpose. So let's talk about the aux source. Well, what this does is, it is where you can assign a secondary parameter to any existing modulation. So by existing, I've already modulated something. I have the source LFO1 modulating my course pitch. So let's assign the mod wheel to this. So now I have a secondary parameter, which is the mod wheel, being applied and assigned to my first modulation. So watch my mod wheel down here. Well, right now, if I play with the mod wheel all the way down, I'm moving it on my MIDI keyboard. If I play a note, we're not going to hear that LFO. It's back to normal, right? Well, now if I move my mod wheel up while playing that note, there it is. So that's how the aux source send works. And this is something that you obviously cannot do on the oscillator page. So it's the second thing that you can't really do. Third thing, actually. It's the third thing. You can't access the global controls. You can't curve. And you can't do aux sources by just doing drag and drop. So let's look at this curve now because you get to see how this works in a real world example. So it's grayed out right now, which means it is inactive. Well, let's say I want this vibrato, or I wanted to use what we just set up as a vibrato. Pretend this is on a really cool preset. And I want it to be less noticeable when I first start to move the mod wheel. Maybe the first half of the mod wheel, it's just a very subtle effect, but I want it to be intense at the top. Well, to do that, I'm going to use this curve, and you have two curves in the mod matrix, and this curve just applies to your aux source. And now I'm going to drag it down. So you can see visually that's going to cut out some of this effect and then kind of build into it. So let's see how this sounds now. So my mod wheel's halfway up, and it's not that noticeable. If I turn this back to default, this is going to be really noticeable. All right, so see how that works? It's a pretty cool way to do it, and it's actually going to be really useful when you make sounds. Okay, so this output is just the scalar. It's for the aux source. It's just another way to control the amount or how prominent the effect is. And let's talk about this mod. What this will do is it'll inverse it will take it, or you can bypass your whole signal flow. So that's a cool thing. So this is essentially like, you can see here that this is grayed out now on the screen. So it's essentially like right-clicking and selecting bypass on the drop-down menu. You can do it there. All right, so that concludes the mod matrix in Serum. I will see you in the next section.